Welcome everybody to the City of Edina's 7th Annual Days of Remembrance. This event started in 2011 as a result of a resident that asked that we put on a presentation acknowledging and remembering the survivors and the victims of the Holocaust, and also acknowledging the liberators also during the Holocaust and genocides. We've since expanded this event to other genocides. In the past years, we've talked about Rwanda, we've talked about the Congo, we've talked about the Armenians that happened only 30 years before the Holocaust, and then talked about the Holocaust. The main purpose of this event is really to understand the atrocities and the beginnings that occur before a Holocaust and a genocide occur. So as a community, we can all come together to understand what is happening, what are the injustices that are occurring, and what can we do. Over the years, we've talked about not being a bystander, not sitting by and watching things being taken away from people, but to be an upstander, to really step in and make a positive difference to the people that are all around us. And if you notice that Edina has become a very diverse community. And I start out by saying is, I was not born in Edina. I'm not from Minnesota. I am a first generation born American. I am a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. But even if you're not any of those, you either know people who have been involved in it, or you've witnessed people who have been involved in it, and the answer is we should all treat each other equally and help each other out. So what we want to do is listen to the stories of our two guest speakers that we'll have today. Today we'll be learning about the Holocaust and also the Bosnian genocide from our two speakers. We'll also have a panel where our two speakers and myself will sit here, and you'll be able to ask us questions. So we'll hold our questions till after they speak. And then this year is also new in our program. We have surveys. So we're looking to see how you found out about this event. Also, any suggestions that you might have for the future, for themes or even speakers for our Holocaust event. Again, what we're really proud of is that this came from our community, which is wonderful. And also to put on our event this year, we also had volunteers in the community helping us out, plus our student commissioners. So I'm proud that Edina is having this 7th annual event. Before we start, I want to introduce Mayor Hovland. He is always excited, by the way, to make a speech and be part of our event. So
I don't know about make a speech, but I'll have a few remarks as we've embarked on this, or as Jan says, over the last 7 years. Edina is one of the few cities, I think, in the state that has maintained this Days of Remembrance on an annual basis. It all started as a national event, and we just kept it going thanks to our Human Rights and Relations Commission. So let's talk about what's going on today in the world. We've got a French election going on where we're seeing firsthand, just like we did in our country in November, we're seeing the politics of hostility, this politics of enmity that is causing so much difficulty and transcending, I think, really into a level of hatred for people that aren't like us, that speak a different language, that worship in a different way, whose skin might be a different color. And we all know the perils of that kind of a pathway, because we're going to hear from a woman today who's going to remind us of all of the persecution that Jewish people suffered on a historic basis and survived, even surviving the horrors of the Holocaust. So this is really important information for all of us to have and to bear witness to, and as Jan said, to be a upstander, not just a bystander. So when we see this dialogue start to commence, and it starts slowly, it starts with a little mild criticism, and then it grows from there, and you can kind of feel what's happening here. We all need to be vigilant about this, and we all need to call it for what it is. Because it's a pathway we do not want to go down again as a city, as a state, as a country, and as a world. We just cannot go there. So all of you, I thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to the presentations on both these very, very important subjects. And thanks for being in Edina today. Yeah.
yourself to everybody.
All right, perfect. Hi, my name's Connie. I am a student commissioner for the Edina Human Rights and Relations Commission, and I'm here to introduce our first speaker today, Ms. Joni Sussman. So, Ms. Sussman was the former president of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Minnesota and Dakotas. Additionally, she is the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, and she's here to explore the generational impacts of the Holocaust. And additionally, her passion for talking about the Holocaust has led her to find Hayam, or the Children of Holocaust Survivors of Associations of Minnesota. So let's please all give a warm welcome to Ms. Joni Sussman.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you for giving up a beautiful Sunday to come and listen to something that I think is actually really important. I want to thank the mayor for continuing to have a program like this. Becoming an upstander, standing up for what's right, is really important, and I'm here to tell you what happens when you don't have enough people standing up for what's right. I just want to let you know that I am a children's book publisher by trade, so when you see there's some, I've published some books about the Holocaust because that's something that matters a lot to me, and if you want to take a look at some of them, they're out there, and there's bookmarks if you are interested in them. I also want to point out this book, Witnesses to the Holocaust, which includes stories of Holocaust survivors and liberators from the state of Minnesota, that was published by the Jewish Community Relations Council. And I'll be donating the samples of all of these books to Edina for the library and to have as a resource. So it's hard to tell a whole life story in a half an hour, but I'm going to give it a shot. My parents were both born in Lithuania, and by the way, I'm a resident of Edina, and my parents were both residents of Edina, and I think they would be so touched to see that this program is going on in our community today. Certainly it's a very different Edina from the one that was here maybe 50 years ago, so this is just a wonderful program. So to go to my parents' story, I'm going to tell my mom's story because it's hard to sort of take 2 tracks at the same time. But my parents are both from Lithuania. Lithuania is one of the 3 Baltic countries. If you're familiar with the geography, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They were free countries until 1940, when they were taken over by the Russians. So when the Germans came in a year later in 1941, they actually thought that the Germans were going to be liberating them from the Russians. They had no idea what was coming their way. So the other thing is, as you know, the war started in 39. So by 41, things were already well along. And so they didn't have a time to get used to anything. In Germany, things started slowly. In Austria, things started slowly. But by the time the Germans came into Lithuania, it was an overnight change. They came in July 1941. My mom was a 19-year-old university student, and she happened to be home for the summer because it was break. She had a younger brother also at university, and a younger sister who was still in high school. She was 13 at the time. When the Nazis came in, right away, everything changed. Jews were not allowed to work in their businesses anymore. My grandfather had been a director at a shoe factory. He designed shoes, and he immediately lost his job. Everything changed overnight. The Jewish children had to turn their pets into the police department because, you can imagine as you were a kid, if you weren't allowed to have a pet and your other friends were. So some of the things were small things like that. It's not like the Germans came right out into the streets shooting immediately. The first thing they did was enact the Nuremberg laws. And these were the laws that said Jews and non-Jews basically couldn't have any kinds of relationships. Non-Jews could not go to Jewish doctors. And they really involved all of the citizens in the country in perpetuating anti-Semitism. For example, if you were a school teacher, and let's say that you were a math teacher, all of a sudden the textbooks changed and the the story problems had to do with Jews and non-Jews. How many Jews stole how many apples from someplace? Or other things like that. And if you're an 8-year-old kid, you listen to your teachers and you do what they say. Another example that I give, which my husband hates because he's an architect, is how do you think that the concentration camps got built? They didn't just spring up overnight, right? The government went to architects and engineers and requested RFPs asking, how do you build the most efficient gas chamber that kills the most people in the shortest amount of time, and what kind of gas do you use? So, the Nazis, my point is really that the Nazis weren't just goose-steppers in their uniforms, the scary guys that you see in the movies. It was really everyday people who went along with the program and didn't stand up to say no. So things got very difficult in Lithuania really from the very beginning. First came the laws of, that affected their everyday life. And the second thing that happened was that the Jews were then separated from the rest of the community and put into ghettos. And a similar version of this happened all over Europe. Everywhere that the Nazis went, first they identified the Jews, then they separated the Jews out, and eventually they took them to the concentration camps. Now, the Jews, of course, didn't know what was coming. And people say to me, well, why didn't they leave? These were Nazis, these were bad. Why didn't your parents leave? Well, first of all, it wasn't really possible to leave. If you had a family, you couldn't just pick up and go. You had grandparents, you had connections to the community, and where were you going to go? You couldn't just leave. So what happened was, after these laws were passed and it was time for the Jews to be put into ghettos, first they had to identify them. And how did they do that? Today we have driver's licenses that we use for ID. In those days they had passports, and their passports had their religion on them. They were like ID things. So all the Jews in Lithuania, and again in every other country, had a J or some other marking on their passport that identified them as Jews. So first of all, if a Jew was stopped in the street, you ask for their ID papers, you know who they are. The second thing is they just asked the neighbors. So again, this was an opportunity for people to stand up and be the good guys, and most people failed to do that. The Nazis would come to a building or a neighborhood and say, tell us where the Jews lived, which apartments, which houses, and you all live in neighborhoods, you know a little bit about your neighbors, you'd be able to identify them, but would you? And in those days, and at that time, everybody did. So it wasn't so hard for the Nazis to figure out who the Jews were. So at that point, one day, they said, tomorrow morning, everybody needs to leave their houses or apartments, rich, poor, all the neighborhoods in the city. All the Jews needed to leave their apartments and areas and be contained in really the poorest section of the city, which became the ghetto. You're familiar with some of the ghettos, like the Warsaw Ghetto that had walls around them and all of that. These had the one in Lithuania, which I've actually seen. We took a family trip back there. The ghetto that my parents were in was like a gated area with a wooden gate, and it was a very, very poor part of the city. And so all the Jews came, and they said you could only really take as much as you could carry. People didn't have cars that they could take things. And so it was really whatever you could carry. And if you were carrying the 2-year-old, you really couldn't carry much else. If you were helping the grandmother, you didn't have that hand for a suitcase. So people took what they thought they would need. And the weather and geography in Lithuania is very much like Minnesota. 4 seasons, snow, warm winter. So you really needed a lot of things. And people took what they could. And of course, they also took family photos, Shabbat candlesticks, things that mattered to them. But they had very little that they could take. They moved into the ghetto, and in the ghetto, each family was given not a whole apartment, but a room. Not a whole house, but a room. So somebody had the kitchen, somebody had the bedroom, and you see a little bit of this in the Diary of Anne Frank, if you've ever read that, where you had to negotiate. If you were given the bedroom and you needed to cook dinner, you needed to negotiate with the kitchen family how you were going to do that. It was very, very difficult. There was no plumbing. It was all outhouses and outdoor facilities, and you can imagine that it was very, very overcrowded. You had many people living in a much smaller space than had been intended, and as a result, really it was very, very difficult times. There was no food. People were dying of typhus and other kinds of illnesses, and things became very, very difficult. What did they do in the ghetto? If you were between the ages of 12 and maybe 40, you were considered to be a worker. And all those workers would get together, line up in the morning in rows of 5, and they would march them out to work in the factories because the German army needed things for its army, leather goods, and this was a community that had a lot of leather. I mentioned that my grandfather worked in the shoe business. Leather goods was really what was going on there, and there were these big leather factories, and so they used the Jews as slave labor from the ghetto to work in these factories. If you were under the age of 12 or over the age of 40, you were considered non-worker, and you stayed behind, and the older people took care of the little ones. I tell you this partly so you understand what was going on, but also I want to tell you an incident that happened that my mother related to us. She was part of the worker group, and she and her immediate family were all older than 12 and under the 40, and they all went to work one day in this leather factory that's across the street from the ghetto. And again, I've been there, and I stood in the ghetto, and I could see the factory that I'm telling you about. And they were working on the second floor, and all of a sudden they noticed all these trucks, German trucks, coming into the ghetto, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They couldn't really see that well, and the trucks came in, and they noticed them driving kind of through the streets, and then they left. When they came home at the end of the day, all the children were gone. The Nazis had come in, they had collected all of the kids, they had taken them away. And of course, the 40 and up, the older people, it's funny to think of 40 as being older people, but they, the people said to them, can you imagine being a parent who had gone to work in the morning, you come home and your children are gone? And they said, what happened? Where did they take them? And the rumor went around that they had been taken to Switzerland. Now that, as you know, would have maybe been an okay thing because Switzerland was neutral, but in fact the children had been taken to Auschwitz, because when the older people asked the soldiers, where are you taking the children? They said in German, Auschwitz, but the German word for Switzerland is der Schweiz. And no one had ever heard of Auschwitz, which today everyone knows that word. So when the soldiers said Auschwitz, they heard Switzerland. And they found out not that much later that the kids had been taken away to Auschwitz. My mom was saying that the ghetto was such a sad and terrible place with no children. And interestingly, I grew up in Kenwood, and when my parents were ready to retire, they didn't want to downsize, they just wanted to move into a place that had everything on one floor. And everyone said, there's these great senior housing places, and it's great because it's really quiet and there's no children. And my parents said, we never want to live in a place without children. And they bought a house in Edina. So, this is something that they carried with them their whole time. Now, you can understand why Hitler would want to take the children, right? Not only did he not want to feed them because they were a waste and they wouldn't work, not only did he want to demoralize the parents, because, when you lose your kids, up until then, you're going to fight. Anybody here who's got kids or has been a kid, parents will do anything for their children, and once there's no children, the fight went out of them. So it was easier to control this group. The other thing is, if you want to eliminate the Jews forever, what better way to do it than to eliminate the whole next generation? And so it was very common that first they would take the children away. So the children were gone, things were very difficult in the ghetto, they got much, much harder after that, and the next step in the process was that they would then take the Jews and move them to the concentration camps. Now, we know what those are, but at the time, when I asked my mother, even well into the war, even when they were actually being taken to the concentration camps, they had not heard of them, they didn't know what they were, they didn't know where they were going, and the Germans used all these euphemisms. You're being transported to somewhere else, you're being relocated, things will be fine, take your suitcases with you. And so this was all going on, and it's not like today where you've got the internet or lots of ways to get news. Some people had secret radios, which were illegal, but it was very hard to get any sort of news of what was going on in the world. So the time came that they were going to transport them to the concentration camps. And again, they had what they called an action or a selection, and the Jews were called into the sort of main area of the ghetto, and they divided them up. This is the point at which the men and women were separated. Up until then, families had been together, people had stayed together if they could, but at this point, there was actually an effort made to separate the families. So the men and women were no longer together. So now my mother's story, up until then, and by the way, my parents didn't know each other before the war. They were from the same town, and they had some sort of overlapping friends, but they weren't actually together. I'll get to that if we have time at the end, and you can ask me that in the questions part. I'll tell you about that. But now the stories are going to separate. So my mother, with her mother and younger sister, went in one group, and the men were taken separately. So the women were put on a train, and my mother was always very good about talking about her experiences. She really felt, from the time we were old enough to understand and from the time we were able to ask questions, she felt it was important for us to know who we were and where we came from and what our story was. And she would always say, we have nothing to be ashamed of. We're survivors. We weren't the bad guys. We didn't do anything. There's nothing to be ashamed of in this history. And I must tell you that that's not the case for all survivor families. Many Holocaust survivors did not talk about their experiences. But my mom always did. And I mention this because she never talked about this train ride. She talked about being a kid. She talked about the ghetto and some terrible things that I'm coming to in a minute. But that 3 days of train ride, she never talked about. That was the most devastating piece of her experience in some ways, although you'll see it actually gets terrible. But you can imagine being, any of you who've ever been to the Holocaust Museum, they do have a car there that was one of the ones that may have been used during the Holocaust, and people were just crammed in together. Women giving birth in these cars. There's no bathroom, there's no food, there's no water. People dying and just moving the bodies to a different part of the car because what else, there was nothing that they could do. So it was a terrible experience and they didn't know where they were going. So it turns out that where my mom and her mother and sister were going was to a concentration camp called Stutthof. Stutthof is not a camp that exists anymore today. My dad went to the concentration camp of Dachau, which you can still visit. It's outside of Munich. But my mother was in a camp called Stutthof, which was in sort of northern Germany and Poland. And when they got to that camp, the women were taken, about 1,000 women, and their job was to dig anti-tank ditches. Now, my mom said when they first got to the concentration camp, they were so scared and so exhausted and hungry, they didn't know what was going to happen. And the very first thing they did was they put everybody through a shower and they shaved everybody's heads. And you can only imagine what that would be like for these young girls, for them seeing their mother, for the mother seeing her kids. I'm not sure, as I've gone through my life, when I was a kid, I used to think, what would it have been like to be the kid, my mother? And then once I had my kids, and as I was older, I thought, what would have been like to be my grandmother trying to protect her kids? I just can't even imagine such a thing. And so they shaved all their heads, and my mom said this was the last time that she had anything that she actually owned. By then, they were down to nothing. All those suitcases and candlesticks and all that, long gone, nothing. They each had one thing. My grandmother, before they left the ghetto, there were 5 people in the family. So it was, my mother, sister, brother, and 2 parents, 5 of them. And my grandmother cut out tiny little photos, the head of each family member, like the size of your thumbnail, and each of them were carrying that. It's so tiny. But when they came to the concentration camp and they were going to have their showers and all of that, the Nazis were so concerned that someone would be hiding diamond rings or who knows what, that the very last thing my mom said, they took all their clothes, so she doesn't have a pocket to put them in anymore. They're all standing there naked with their heads shaved. And my mother still had the photos between her fingers like this. The only thing she owned in the world. And the very last thing the Nazis said was, okay, everybody, spread your feet. And she said her last possession was these little tiny photos of her family. And as a result of that, photos have always been really special to me. Well, I'm usually very good about this. Anyway, photos have always been very special, and one of the things that I did even when my kids were little was to send copies of photos to other people, because the couple of photos that we do have from before the war were photos that were sent by my parents' family to relatives in South Africa or something, and that's the only way we have any photos, because the actual ones were all gone. So now here they are. They've lost everything. They're standing there. You can imagine the mother and the 2 daughters. They don't know what to do. So they give them the prison clothes, like you've seen, the striped uniform things, and clogs, and various kinds of shoes. My mom said there's just a pile of shoes, and they handed shoes to people. So some people got high heels. My mother got high heels. She broke off the heels so at least she could walk. Other people got clogs. Other people got men's shoes, whatever it was. But they knew they'd need those things, right? They know what the weather's like. And as it turns out, they were in Poland, but they knew that the chances for having to have something warm on your feet was really very important. And so then they put them in tents, and the 1,000 women were living in tents on the ground. And the job was, as I said, to dig anti-tank ditches. So by now, we're pretty far into the war. This is 1944, right? We know the war is coming to an end. They don't know it, but we know. And what was happening was that the armies were coming from both sides, right? You got the Russians coming from the east, you got the Western Allies coming from the west, and the Germans are in between. And the Germans' idea was to dig 2 sets of huge anti-tank ditches to be able to stop the tanks from either army that would be coming along. And that was their job. So you can imagine emaciated, starving women with pickaxes digging anti-tank ditches, and yet they did. And my mom said it was terrible. They were starving, they were sick, they were very, very demoralized. And she said they were working in groups of 5 in these anti-tank ditches, which were like as big as this room, coming to a V here. And they're digging in their little group of 5, and one of the women says to them, girls, she was talking to my mom, her sister, and there was a 3rd young person, and then 2 adults, my grandmother and this other woman. She said, and somebody else, and she said to them, girls, when the war is over, when we survive, interestingly, not if we survive, but when we survive, you girls are going to have missed a whole bunch of your education. So we're going to have a little school here in the anti-tank ditch. Now, this is the craziest thing in the world because you've got the guards walking back and forth up on top with guns. You were supposed to work in silence, but this woman was determined that she was going to bring education to these kids. And each person in the group was assigned 1 day to teach something. My mother spoke French and was studying French, and so her day she did French. The woman who had started this had been a pediatrician before the war, and on her day she talked medical stuff. And my mother knew a crazy amount of crazy medical stuff when I was a kid. I don't know. So, you've got the woman doing pediatrics, and my mother's teaching French, and people are doing different things, but there was one woman there from Belgium, one woman in the group, and she had been a housewife, and she didn't have anything, she said, that she could teach, but her problem was she talked about food all the time, and that just made them crazy, right? They're starving. And so they said, look, here's the deal. On your day, I forgot the name of the woman, on your day, Belgian lady, you can tell recipes. But you can't talk about food at any other time. But on your day, they called it, I can't remember what her name was, but they called it like Alicia Cooks. And on her cooking day, she told recipes. And I said to my mom, how did you listen to recipes, when you were starving? And my mom said, it's not like it is today where you can go to Byerly's and find everything. We were from Lithuania. This lady was from Belgium. She gave us cake recipes with pineapples. We didn't know from pineapples. We had never had a banana. The things she talked about didn't resonate with us. And so we could do it. And again, my mother was a marvelous baker, and we have some former friends here who can attest to that. I mean, friends from our childhoods here. And my mother was a wonderful baker, and I don't know that she picked up some of these recipes, but she did beautiful torts and things with very elaborate fruits. And again, you just don't know where your education would lead you. But what this woman told them is, the Nazis can take everything away from us, everything, but they can't take our educations, they can't take what we carry in our heads and our hearts. And so this is something that's important for you to know. And my mother, clearly remembered that all her life. So now here they are, they're digging in the anti-tank ditch. We all know that the war is coming to an end. It gets to be December 44. Gets to be January 45. It's winter, right? Winter in Minnesota, you're not digging anything, right? The ground is frozen. And the women were very scared because they knew that if they couldn't work, nobody was really going to, their lives were not going to be worth anything. And they were very, very scared. And eventually they stopped working. The Nazis had them stop working, and they were very nervous. One day, a couple days after the work stopping, they had another selection and action. All the women, 1,000 women who were in this camp of tents, came together, and they had a selection very much like you see in the movies. The commandant of the camp stood at the front, and all the women lined up, and one by one, they'd come to him, and he would say to the right or to the left. Now, you don't know what's, is the right good? Is the left good? What, everything, it's a world of crazy. And so they didn't really know what to do. But what are you going to do? You're in line. So there's a bunch of people, and then my grandmother, my mother, and her younger sister are lined up in that way. So it gets to be my grandmother's turn. She comes to the front of the line, and the commandant says to her, to the left. She goes to the left. Then it's my mother's turn. And they're looking, there's groups, 2 groups. It's my mother's turn. And the commandant says to her, there's only 1,000 women in this camp. That's not a big group. I went to a high school bigger than that, right? So the commandant knew many of the people in this camp. And he says to my mother, I know that you're her daughter, so I'm going to give you a choice. You can go to the left with her, or you can go to the right. You choose. And my mom said she didn't even blink. Of course she went with her mother. And then her younger sister, who was 17, she comes up, and the commandant gives her the same choice. You with your mother or the other way. And her sister also chooses to go with them. So it turns out that the group that they're in is a group of 90 women. And the other group of 800 and 900 women are lined up into groups, rows of 5, and marched out of the camp with guards. So now there's this group of 90 women that's left in the camp. They don't know what's going to happen, but then that group gets lined up, and they have 2 guards, one in front and one in back, and they march them out of the camp. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows what's happening. It's January, figure a Minnesota winter, right? Snow up to your knees. And this is a rural area, forests, some farmland, that sort of thing. And they walk and walk and walk. Then it gets to be nighttime. And they put them into a barn to sleep overnight. And the women are very scared. By now, they're very panicked, and they've heard that, maybe they'll light the barn on fire and kill them all. They had no idea. And they were panicked. They didn't sleep well. The next morning, they wake up. Again, they're on the road. No food, no water. This is already day 2. And so they're marching along, and all of a sudden, they're on a road. And you can picture this because we're in Minnesota. You can see this. If you lived in Florida, you wouldn't be able to picture this, but in Minnesota, you can. They were on a road like when you drive up in northern Minnesota, and it's like a dirt road, and on both sides of the road is forest, and on one side in front of one of the forests is kind of a clearing. And the snow is up to their knees. They're marching along, like this, not even marching really, but walking, and it's very hard. And remember, they don't have coats, they don't have anything. They're just wearing their little concentration camp uniform, and some of them had shoes and some of them didn't. And all of a sudden, the 2 guards say to them, quick, get off the road. And my mom says to her mother, what do you think's going on here? And the way they were marching was in rows of 5. They always marched them that way. And what they did was they always had my grandmother march in the middle so that they could each hold on to one of her hands. And if they got separated, one or the other of the daughters would be with the mother. And so there they were in their row of 5. And their mother says, of course, I don't know. Maybe the war is ending. Maybe there's Allied troops and they don't want to be found, here, maybe they just want us to get off the road and go into the woods. Who knows? So all of the 90 women turn and they start going into the snow. And you can picture this as a Minnesotan, into the snow and kind of walking, and they can't stay in their rows of 5 anymore, right? Because it's, you had to kind of spread out and you're walking in the snow and they all sort of spread out. And all of a sudden, and they're going towards the trees, and all of a sudden they hear a gunshot and they turn around and the guards are shooting into the air. My mom said she just couldn't understand what was going on, but her mother understood right away. And she dropped the girls' hands and said to them, run. And my grandmother ran towards the guards, shouting, don't shoot my children. She distracted them. They shot her. She fell. The girls ran. My mother grabbed her younger sister. They ran into the woods, and they could hear all this. It was a massacre, basically. They were shooting into the crowd, and they could hear screaming and shooting. And my mom said they ran and ran in this forest. It's like Hansel and Gretel. They're in the woods, she and her sister, these 2 girls, and they're running and running. And my mom said, They just lost track of time. She didn't know what was going on. She remembered that when the shooting started, the sun was high in the sky, so it must have been around noon. And by now, they ran and ran, and it was starting to get dark. So she thought, well, it must be 3, 4 o'clock. They just had no idea. It's not like they had watches. They didn't know what day it was. They didn't know what country they were in. Nothing. And my mom said they ran and ran until finally they were just exhausted, and they sat down by a tree. She said my aunt, her little sister, was shivering, and as it turns out, she had typhus, which she didn't know, but she was burning up with fever. She was shivering, and my mom figured, if I don't get this kid to shelter, we're going to die here in the woods, she for sure. And so they made their way out to the woods, out of the woods. They tried to find the clearing where the massacre was, but she said, we couldn't find it. We didn't know where we were. We were shell-shocked. They made their way out onto a road, and my mother, who spoke 7 languages fluently, could read Polish, and there was a sign in Polish, and so they knew they were in Poland, that said so many kilometers to some little town. So she says, we're going to just have to try to make it. And she's going along the road, and out of the woods comes another woman, and she says to them, oh my God, you girls have survived. How did, and I'm so glad to see that you've survived. And they said to this woman, how did you survive? And she said, when the shooting started, I lay down on the ground and pretended that I had been shot. And usually the Nazis were onto that game, and they would go at the end of a massacre and shoot every single person in the head, right? They were onto that. But this was the very end of the war, as you'll see. The guards were scared because there were Allied troops in the area, and so they shot as much as they could, and then they ran. And so this woman, she saw the guards run off. She got up, and she went and saw, tried to see if anyone else had survived. And the girl said, of course, our mother, did she survive? And the woman said, she's gone. And they said, we want to go back and see her. And the woman said, absolutely not. We're not going back there. We have to look towards the future. Let's go. We have to find shelter. Your sister is ill. And they walked along, and out of the woods comes another woman, and she's holding her arm like this, and she had been shot through the neck, and the bullet had come out the side, but she had survived, and they took her with them, and little by little, there was a group of 10 women who had survived this massacre. They, little by little, came out onto the road, and they made their way into this little town, and they figured, what can they do? They'll go to the church, right? What's the most likely thing? The priest will help them. They knocked on the door, and the priest said, get away from here. This town is under siege. There's Germans here. There's Germans. There's Allies coming. We can't help you, and get away from here. We don't want you anywhere near here. And so they didn't know what to do. They went and sat in the middle of the town, and my mom said she could see people like peeking through their curtains, because there's these 10 raggedy women, bald in concentration camps uniforms sitting in the town. And she said finally somebody came out of their house and gave them a little bit of water and said to them, there's a barn up on the hill. You can go in that barn. And so they went up into the barn, and my mom said there was a cow in the barn, and that was the best thing. And I said to my mom, why was it the best thing that there was a cow in the barn? Did you have like milk? And she said, no, the cow was warm. And they went and they all put their hands on the cow. I'm picturing these 10 women putting their hands on the cow to try to stay warm. And they tore off my mom said she tore off the bandage of a thing, and they bandaged the woman who was wounded, and somebody else was hurt. And they just sort of did the best they could, no food, but a little bit of water. And they fell asleep. And the next morning, they could hear shooting in the town. So really, this was the very, very end of the war, and they could hear shooting in this little town. And my mom, again, heard, at the beginning, she was hearing all these commands in German. So she knew that the Germans had control of the town. But later on in the fighting, she started to hear Огонь, which is the Russian word for fire. So she knew that the Russians were starting to, sort of overtake the town. And after a while, the shooting stopped, and somebody came and knocked on their door and said, if you open the door now, you'll see the first Russian tanks are coming into the village, and we're liberated. And my mom said, they pushed open this big barn door, and they stood on the hill, and they saw the Russian tanks coming in, and it was the end of the war. So basically, she lost her mother the day before the end of the war. So people say, oh, your Liberation Day, wasn't it a happy day? And she said, well, not really. One more day and her mother would have survived. And that's the grandmother that I'm actually named after, Joanna. My grandmother was Zhenya. So this was the end of the war for my mother. And the Russians came in, and the women were very nervous about the Russians coming in because they had heard terrible things about the Russian troops. But these guys actually were terrific, and they went up, they carried the women down, and they told one of the houses to empty the house and let the women stay there. And interestingly, all the people in the town started to say, oh yes, we were taking care of these, these people who, now they wanted to be the good guys. So there was definitely irony in that story. But my mom said that when she came into this house, this was the first house she had been in a number of years, and she walked into the bedroom past a dresser with a mirror on it, and she saw someone reflected in the mirror, and she looked behind her to see who it was, and it was her, because she hadn't looked in a mirror in all those years. So this is how at least this section of the war ended for my mom. There's much more to the story, and my dad has an equally astonishing story, but I want to be cognizant of the time, and I really want to thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Neeti, and I'm a volunteer for this event, and I'm also a resident of Edina. Thank you all for joining us here. Our second speaker is Dr. Rozman-Clark. She was born in Yugoslavia and experienced the effects of war firsthand when she was just 15 years old. Years later, while working in refugee camps in her war-torn country, she made a commitment to do everything she could to help those whose life has been unjustly disrupted by the conflict. Since then, she has kept her commitment and her promise, and she has worked countless hours for a variety of nonprofit organizations in multiple countries like Kosovo, Bosnia, and Macedonia. She also worked as an intern at United Nations and did her thesis on the failed peacekeeping intervention during the Bosnian genocide, where she gathered personal testimonies from the survivors and the peacekeepers. That effort made her realize the power of sharing these stories with the rest of the world, and hence Green Card Voices was founded. She is the co-founder and executive director of Green Card Voices. It's an organization which is dedicated to share the stories of immigrants and to reduce the divide between the immigrants and non-immigrants communities in the United States. So without further delay, let's hear it from Dr. Tea.
So usually I speak for work and I speak without a paper, but this is deeply personal, so I apologize in advance just in order to keep a flow going. I'll have to read a little bit. So before I begin, I would really like to thank Neeti for reaching out and giving me this opportunity. I understand this is the first time that I will be speaking about the Srebrenica genocide, and it's my great honor to do so. So, I am very honored, like I said, to share some of the insight of my personal experience with you and help us remember those people that we've lost in such a horrific, unimaginable way. I was born in Ljubljana, Republic of Slovenia, in a country called Yugoslavia. And just like some of you here, I had a very, very happy childhood. I was completely unaware that the world around me is going to change forever, and that the country that I was living in was coming to an end after a 37-year long regime that ended with the death of the then president, President Josip Broz Tito. So after he died, a scramble for power followed, and I was 15 when the war started. So in Ljubljana, we had a so-called 10-day war, but it was the very, very first country that was attacked, so we did not expect anything. My family, my parents, my sister, my younger sister, and I lived in a public housing. Under the socialist regime, you didn't really own property, so that was the way to live. And I remember the air raid sirens and roadblocks that filled the streets of our capital city. It was, school had just ended, so it was just the beginning of summer vacation for us. And all I can really say, it's just the most surreal experience that you can imagine. Just that spring, my sister and I got a puppy that we wanted forever. And in our building where we lived, there was 80 apartments, or condos, as you call them here. And when the air raid sirens went off, we all had to go down in the basement. But there was just not enough room. So I'll never forget, on the first day, when that happened, we all brought, some people even brought parrots and hamsters and dogs and cats. And because, you just didn't know what was going to happen. So after the first day, they said that pets are forbidden, so we can't bring them. And from that period, the one thing I remember is us having to leave our dog on the 5th floor. Oh, I'm sorry. As we went down to the basement. So that was my first taste of war, and a feeling of fear and other sense of defeat. That you couldn't really control the situation. And it really forced me at that young age to realize that the world is actually not that kind, and that unfair choices had to be made. And looking back, it was just a 10-day war, and it ended because the Yugoslav army was then starting to fight wars in Bosnia and Croatia, and it was just too far to continue fighting in Slovenia. So we were just unbelievably lucky. And after only 36 casualties and 300 people wounded, they've left the region altogether. So weeks after that, I remember being at the train station in Ljubljana. And I had never seen so many people at that train station in my life. There were families. They literally had plastic bags with stuff in them, not even suitcases. Some had nothing. And we soon realized that there were people coming from Croatia and Bosnia, and they literally just grabbed what they could in a few minutes and just hopped on a train before the border closed. And we had refugee camps created throughout Slovenia. So as the Yugoslav army left, there were 56 army buildings that were completely emptied and left behind, and they were all converted into refugee camps. I by then had started high school and eventually college, and I have spent my time volunteering in the camps, and I just spent really, really a lot of time there. So after those conflicts, then we had conflict in Croatia and Bosnia. So we had conflict between 91 until 2001, so 10 years of conflict. And I really have to say that, from those first days when I heard the air raid sirens, in 91, when I was 15, I was really pushed to define how I would live my life. And I learned awful things sometimes happen to wonderful people. And I learned that collective effort is necessary to make positive changes. And I also learned we cannot wait for wrongs to be undone, but we always have to try and act. So, I don't know how much you know about the siege of Sarajevo and the rape camps, and I mean, it just was just so unbelievable. But 4 years into the Bosnian war, and just 10 days shy of my 19th birthday, Srebrenica genocide took place. And 8,372 people, mostly men and boys older than 11 years, were all killed in a span of 5 short days. So Ljubljana and Srebrenica are apart the same distance as Minneapolis and Milwaukee. And as I was looking at the pictures, you know, those people looked like me. I understood their language. I know they had the same dreams as me. And this act, this killing, this genocide in Srebrenica is now known as the largest massacre in Europe since World War II, and one of the greatest UN failures because it happened while the besieged town was supposed to be protected by the UN peacekeepers. So many in former Yugoslavia today will tell you the real struggle for survival and for dignity actually started after the war, after this genocide. Because what actually hurt more than the loss of life were the genocide deniers, and you know, the fact that it's all these years and there's still no closure, really. To add a little bit about my personal story, while I was working in the camps, at the age of 19, when the Srebrenica genocide happened, I was given a form to fill out, and eventually I won a scholarship through Open Society Institute, and I came to study at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And I now live in Linden Hills, but 2 blocks away from Edina. And I am always shopping at Lens, and I actually hang out more in Edina than not. So I just want to give that as a reference so that you understand that someone that's your neighbor today lives with all of this. So I have traveled to Srebrenica in 2005. On the 10th anniversary, I was actually in the middle of my graduate school. I was going at New York University. I did a summer internship in Sarajevo, and then I was like, you know what, I'm already here, let me just go there. It was the 10th anniversary, and really in my mind, I have felt it's been 10 years, people have grieved, you know, lives have sort of went on. But what happens with the Srebrenica genocide, I don't know how much you know, but as they dig the graves, they're able to identify the remains because of the DNA technology. So every person gets the bones of their loved ones. And they're all buried at once on the day of the anniversary. So 600 people were all laid to rest on the day I was there. And what struck me the most was that their family that was laying them to rest, they were all crying and so upset, as if it had happened the day before. It was just unbelievable. And also the process, how it was done, it's just very heartbreaking because the people that committed this crime tried to cover it up. So they would go to places where they had shot this 8,372 men and boys older than 11, and then with machinery, with diggers, dig it all up, and there's a lot of secondary and tertiary, and there's just so many grave sites. So as they were digging it all up, they would maybe find one piece of bone in one grave, another skull in one grave. So the rule was you have to have at least 60% of the bones for it to be considered found, and you could bury the person. But you know, the survivors would find out, you know, in a letter, you know, that said, "Oh, we have found on this gravesite a finger bone, for example," and so forth. So they would slowly get the letters, just tremendous amount of pain every time. So I have, by then, been working at the United Nations, and there's a department called, at the United Nations Peacekeeping, there's a department called the best practices. So you essentially analyze the past mistakes, failures, and you try to address them and give some recommendations how to do better in the future. And at the same time, I also was deciding to continue my studies and do a PhD. So I had traveled back to Srebrenica in 2009, 10, 11, 12, and did the doctoral research. I will tell you today that the only reason why I was able to do that is because I also gave birth to my 2 daughters at the same time. Because it's only by looking and experiencing new life that I was able to even study death. And just having this amazing survivors be my friends, who every day would thank me for doing this difficult work, because they said, everybody forgot about us, but you didn't, and you keep on coming, and we know how this is difficult. And it's for them that I'm here today, and I'm actually wearing, this is a Srebrenica genocide pin. So, yes, what was the most amazing to me to see is that some of the survivors, some of which, you know, have lost so many members, have returned to this town, which is now in the hands of the enemy, of the people that actually committed the crimes. And they live there because they don't want to let the genocide win. They don't want to be ethnically cleansed from their homes. So they've returned, and they live there today. And I want to tell you about one of those people. And her name is Fazila Efendic. And her son would have been 40, just like I am today. And his name was Faizo, and her husband was also killed, and his name was Jairo. And Faizo, I just saw him on the photos, but Fazila talks about him all the time. He had those big, very thick glasses, just a math genius. And just a wonderful, wonderful kid. He won a lot of regional awards for math. And when Srebrenica became occupied and was under, was so-called safe area, they lost power and everything. He was one of the first that was able to use the machine inside the washing machine to use in a little stream by the house. There was a little stream, and he created a generator. And everybody in Srebrenica eventually did that, but that's how they had electricity, so they could read at night and so forth. So, and Fazila is one of those women that went back and those that today that flourish are those that at least had one female child because they didn't kill the girls. So Nirha now has 3 kids. So Fazila is the grandmother of 3 kids, and is if you ever go to Srebrenica, you have to stop by. She has a goat, she has chickens. They're all super fat. I mean, they're just her garden is amazing. Every fruit tree is just so full. All the roses smell like the best rose that you can imagine. It's just a very, very healing place, and at the same time, like someone's watching over her right now, So I just, want to sort of connect it to the world we live now. Well, sorry, first I actually want to say that about the Srebrenica genocide, that it's such a strange case and so unfortunate, but we actually have had people that have been convicted of genocide at The Hague for the acts they committed in Srebrenica, but at the same time, the United Nations is not able to recognize Srebrenica genocide as officially a genocide because of the Russian veto. So last summer, I have traveled with many other people, mostly Bosnians and Bosniaks, and to the United Nations headquarters, and we sort of had a little vigil, and just making sure that that they know that we have not forgotten and that we really want this massacre to be called a genocide, which it was. And we refuse to be, and I refuse to be one of those to be silenced and just stop speaking. So I want to also say that not just the United States, but around the world, we now live in a very, very harsh world. UNICEF reported that more than 16 million babies are born in conflict zones. That's 1 in 8 of all births. And I urge you to remember those that we have lost. I also really hope that you can help those that still have a chance to be saved. And yeah, today I'm a co-founder and executive director of Green Card Voices. It's a nonprofit organization based in Uptown. And I got a PhD in oral history eventually, and in the past 4.5 years while I've been in Minnesota, I had an honor to record 300 stories of people coming from 100 countries around the world that all made Midwest their home. And I really invite you to listen to them. Also listen to what they're experiencing now. I mean, it's only a few months ago that a Somali restaurant in Grand Forks was burned to the ground. It's only a few weeks that a friend of mine in Faribault was driving the bus and her hijab was pulled off. I mean, this is things that are happening right here, right now. And yeah, again, I just want to thank you again for allowing me to speak, and to say that Feyza Efendic, who died at the age of 19, would be 40 today, like myself, and that Feyza, you're not forgotten, and that to 8,372 Bosniak men and boys older than 11 that were killed in 5 short days in July of 1995, you're not forgotten. Thank you.
All right, this is the opportunity for everyone to ask our panel questions that they may have. 2 questions to start us off. One will be, sure.
Excuse me, Jan.
just a question to start us off quick is, what can we do as a community to help support and welcome immigrants that come in?
We here in Edina, or we in America? We where?
America, Edina.
Okay.
I can, sure. You know, a reference before was made that it starts with small comments. I really think so. You know, even if you hear someone that looks different than you or has an accent, don't ask them, where are you from? It's just not nice, because you're constantly reminded that you're not from here. And like, you know, as immigrants, we are your neighbors now. We have chosen this country to be our new home. We are working every day hard to make it better. I just know so many wonderful immigrants and refugees that have made United States their home. They're really, really working very hard. And, you know, we all have the same needs. We all want to see our kids grow up happy. We all want to have joy and happiness in our life. I think as human beings, we share just so much more than we don't. So just embracing one another, just practicing something that's called like intentional diversity, just try to go outside of the bubble. It's really, if I compare life in Midwest and New York City, you know, there in New York City, no one cared about my accent, how my name is pronounced. Yugoslavia, Bosnia, they couldn't care less. They just really wanted to see what I knew and how I can contribute and what my skills and passions are. Here in Midwest, it's really harder for immigrants. It's even now, after 5 years, I can't really say I have a community here. Even though my kids go to Lake Harriet School, I don't know. And I'm sure that people that are of different religion and different race probably must experience this even more. So just try to reach out to different people and make a conscious effort to include them and be a little bit more open. So.
My parents came to the United States as immigrants in 1950, which is a very different time than it is today. And when they came to the United States, they did not know what to expect. They thought there were cowboys and Indians. They thought there were gangsters. It was all based on what they had seen in Hollywood. They too found that the Midwest was a difficult place to be. They had been in New York for a little bit. Here we were then, even more than now, a much more homogeneous community with less diversity. But I'd have to say that things, I think, really have improved here. And even though we're certainly not doing as good a job as we should, I'm hoping that more and more things will get better. And certainly we see in school curricula and the efforts that are made for kids to try to be better citizens, that's a big help. One of the things that my parents felt that was very important was they were very patriotic, and they said that they couldn't understand how Americans didn't take advantage of the opportunity to vote. They had come from a place where there was not the opportunity to vote, and here so many Americans just sort of toss it aside, and I think we've seen some of the results of that in the last, couple of rounds. And I think it's really important to put your money where your mouth is. Work on political campaigns. If you see not good people running for things, work against them. Work for good candidates who will support the kinds of things that we all believe in, as evidenced by your being here today. And I think those are things that can really help. And again, putting out a hand to your neighbor, getting to know your neighbors, especially if they have a culture different from yours. We're Jews. There's not a lot of Jews in Edina, and we invite non-Jews to our Passover Seder so they can see who we are and learn a little bit about that. And we go to their Christmas celebrations so that we can learn about who they are and where they come from. And I think the more of those kinds of things we do, the better community we're going to be.
I agree with all of that. My family immigrated to New York, and New York is a melting pot of every background and every immigrant. And then I moved here, and I was different. I was from New York, I was Jewish. I was a brunette at the time, so I looked different. But I realized everyone here, their grandmother went to Creek Valley and the great-grandmother, and I had not. But we learned as immigrants, and as everyone is saying here, to accept other immigrants, to understand how to put that hand out. I take my children to the International Food Festival every year, so they understand different cultures. We'll go to the Hmong Festival downtown St. Louis Park, or St. Louis. We learn to reach out and understand other cultures, people that look different from us. We learn not to always stay in our own bubble. That's important, to learn about other backgrounds, to learn about other cultures, and to extend that hand to understand people. And I also know that Edina has really changed. We've had so many racial events that have occurred in the last few months. We've had Immigration Forum, also Human Rights Commission in the last few months. So we are really talking more about diversity in Edina than we ever have before. Very proud of them.
This question is really directed at Dr. Rozman-Clark. For Dr. Rozman-Clark, I think we all understand the culpability of those who pull the trigger on a gun. I'm wondering if you can comment on the effect of words that after Tito died, or even may have started before he died, that there were people with strong voices and people who had a platform from which to speak, who talked about division and separation and hatred that led to ultimately other people pulling triggers on guns. I wondered if you'd comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You know, I was 15 at a time, so it was only later on that I studied all these documents for my PhD that I discovered, you know, what was actually happening. But yeah, I mean, Tito died in 1980, and the first conflict didn't start until 11 years later. But in those 11 years, all of that happened, right? You know, the persecution of Albanians in Kosovo and political arrests. You know, what later were the leaders of the Serb Republic. They actually wrote academic articles on how Bosnian Muslims are, you know, intellectually less capable than Bosnian Serbs and so forth. So, I mean, yes, once you start looking into it, it was essentially, you know, 11 years in the making. And everyone was sort of making, again, a case why we're so different, where actually we're not. Because Yugoslavia means, Yugo means south, and Slavia means the Slavic people. So it's the South Slavs. I mean, our languages are 95% the same. Yes, our religions are, you know, different, but as an ethnicity, we're so similar. And what's the greatest irony of it all is that once the war ended, everyone wanted to enter European Union, which by the default has no borders, and you have to get along, you know. So it was really so senseless, looking back on it. But, you know, there was definitely one thing that always intrigued me was, you know, Tito died unexpectedly. He left no successor. And they decided to have, there was 6 republics and 2 autonomic republics, and they decided to rotate a leader from each of the region every 9 months. Because like they divided 4 years into 6 republics, and it ended up being 9 months. So after a few tries, you know, what quickly became very evident is that when you had a Croatian leader for 9 months, he did things for Croatia. When you had, a Kosovo wasn't even part of this part. So excuse me. When you had a Serbian, leader for 9 months, he was doing, So by the time 91 came around, oh my gosh, people were, angry and blaming one another. And I really do have to say, once the conflict starts, once that big spark happens, oh my gosh, because there's just like no going back. Exactly, it's too late, because the second you have casualties and they have families and they have, those survivors feel that they've been wronged and they're in so much pain, they're willing to pick up the gun and put this pain on somebody else. Not all, but all you need is a few, right? And it just keeps on going. So there was just no stopping it once it started. And that was just the greatest pain of it all.
Joni, I wanted to ask you, in your experience growing up here, how did you relate to your fellow classmates or fellow friends when you would go to school or when you would be playing? You grew up in a home probably that was very different, your parents relating this type of history than your average Minnesotan.
Well, I think, one of the main things that was different is that my parents spoke Yiddish at home to each other. They spoke English to us, but they didn't come to the United States speaking very good English, so they kind of learned along with us. And so we had different foods and all kinds of things. It was really an immigrant experience, more than the fact that they were survivors, which didn't really come up. What did come up was we didn't have grandparents, so we would ask our parents what happened, and they would say when we were little, they were killed in the war, and at 5 years old, that's enough. As we got older, they told us more. But becoming American was very fun and interesting. Macaroni and cheese and peanut butter. These were things we did not have in our house. But I later found out that our friends liked coming over because my mother cooked different things that they didn't have in their houses either. So it was very much a two-way street. My parents did have a lot of friends who were Holocaust survivors when we were little, but they pretty quickly assimilated into the broader Jewish community at first, and then into the neighborhood, and they were both, very gregarious, and so that integration wasn't really as difficult as, as you might think that it was. So, and everybody's reality is their own, so I thought everything was fine. This was my family. This is how it was. It never occurred to me that it would be any different, and I'm sure that's true for most kids. I think in a lot of ways it's easiest for kids who accept who they are, no matter what kind of diverse family they come from or whatever country they come from. I think it's harder for adults, actually, than for kids.
Ms. Sussman, I'm curious as to how the story of your family and your Judaism has affected your mother's character, what she went through, what you've heard. I suspect maybe it's made you stronger today. How has this affected you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. My parents were both very strong people, and they celebrated life. You would think that they were Holocaust survivors, and so, life was tough, and they came through some horrifying things. But they really embraced America. They were patriotic. They loved the United States. We celebrated everything. And, their outlook on life was very special. My mom and my dad, too, really viewed themselves as being survivors and not victims, which makes a big difference. And in fact, my mom eventually went on to do a lot of social justice kinds of things. She worked with abused women, talking to them about, you can overcome this. You have to own your experience, and then you have to move on. She was very much about that. So, one of the interesting things is when I was in 7th grade, I was taking German. It was pretty unusual for a Jewish kid to take German, but my mother claimed that speaking 7 languages saved her life, and she was very much about learning any language that you could. I studied a lot of languages in school also, and when I was in 7th grade, I had a German teacher who was the soccer coach. And so he, by the way, taught German, but basically he was the soccer coach. So his German was pretty mediocre. He had been with the American Army in Germany for a little bit. And one day I came home from school and I said to my mom, he taught us a song. She says, what song? So it turns out that it was a Nazi drinking song that he had picked up, and he was a young guy. He had been in Germany in the 50s or 60s, not during the war at all, but these songs were still around. And my mom basically said, that's it. She came to school, she met with Herr Hargraves, and she said to him, she explained who she was, and this was really the first time that she spoke about her Holocaust experiences. He said to her, and he was great, he apologized up and down. He, of course, had no idea, and she said, and by the way, your German's not too good either, honey. But he said, please come and speak to the class and tell them about your experience. Because when I was in school, and maybe many of you here, World War II, there was a chapter on World War II history, but there was really nothing about the Holocaust. And when I was in 7th grade, my mom spoke to my class, and then eventually to friends' classes and my brother's classes and, all the other kids. And that sort of became the beginning of her speaking about the Holocaust, and that was right around at the same time that other survivors were starting to speak up. The first 20 years after the war, nobody wanted to hear about the Holocaust. And whether it was people being afraid that they were going to open a wound, that they were, that they felt guilty, that they felt they didn't do enough, or they felt that my mother would be sad to talk about it, or my dad. So really, survivors will tell you that for 20 years, nobody wanted to hear their stories. There were virtually no books about the Holocaust, no films, nothing. And in the 60s, there was a mini-series called Holocaust. And I don't know how many of you saw that, but that was the beginning of media getting into. It was a fictitious story about a family. One was in the Warsaw Ghetto, one was in Auschwitz. They were all in all the different places. It was a fictionalized thing, but it came with study guides. And that was also when I was maybe in 6th, 7th grade, something like that. And that was the beginning of movies, media, Hollywood, TV, getting into talking about those, those issues and that experience. And that really opened the door. So it was really the 60s before survivors started speaking out.
Green, that 20 years, or that it takes time for people to be able to?
So, yeah, actually the field of oral history was first established, created, enhanced because of the Holocaust. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't have the field today, actually. But what we did notice is that by the time the field of oral history started being strong, a lot of the Holocaust survivors were already very, very old. And what we know about memory studies today is that the longer you wait, the less you remember, or every time you recall or remember or retell, it actually, the way you store it in your brain gets, it stores differently each time you recall or remember or retell. So it gets distorted over time, unfortunately. So what we know now is that the sooner you can capture a testimony, the better it is. So that's why, that was one of my main reasons why I decided to do the Srebrenica oral testimony, because I did it 15 years after it happened, and already so much has been forgotten. People said, oh my gosh, I knew the name, but now I actually don't know it anymore. Just so much was forgotten. And I can't imagine what it would be if we waited even longer. But a lot of the survivors were between 40 and 65, and we know what happens with memory loss, even later. So the that's why the 200 pages of oral testimony that I did with those 30 individuals are very precious and unique, but yeah.
You know, I have mostly a comment, a question at the end, but so I'm 46 yesterday. My interest area within my psychology degree was Jewish studies. So I came here, I saw the thing in the mail or in the newspaper a couple weeks ago stating that this forum was happening, and I put it on my calendar, and I thought it was last week, and I was all disappointed. Then I realized it was today, and I told my family, I'm like, I know you gave me yesterday to do whatever I wanted, but today I'm gonna come here. I have 4 children, and my oldest is 21, he was just in Ljubljana. How do you say that?
Ljubljana.
Yes, that's
Ljubljana.
where he's been studying abroad, and all these places you were talking about, he's just been. And I came here because my biggest fear is that all these stories, our survivors are dying, and there's only so many survivors' families. And my fear, I grew up at Our Lady of Grace. I have 8 older brothers and sisters. My fear is those stories are going to be gone and that forgotten. And I look at my youngest, who's 9, and I have to go back a little bit. Part of that is, yes, the Holocaust. Coming here, forgetting about all the other genocide that has happened since then and is going on now, and that we have to be able to stop. So I'm looking at my 4 kids. Oldest is 21, youngest is 9, social media. So I'm looking here, thinking as I'm sitting here listening to you all, I'm thinking, how are we, my age group, gonna look at our children and say, we need to do something. I tell my kids every day, every person you meet we don't know what their story is. Everybody has a story. And we might not learn that story, but if we can look at them and smile and try to make somebody's day, what's better than trying just to be a good person? And not looking at everybody as different. Every middle schooler, every adolescent is so worried about being different. How do we instill that? And that, I think, to me, is the most important thing for me to get from the 3 of you up here, just being here talking, and all of you here. If we can all remember that we are all going in the same place, we're all trying to be a place where we can support one another, but we have to think about now what our parents, grandparents did. How are we going to give back to them with what our children can do? I don't know what that question or what that answer would be, but
I would say one thing. One of the things that really has changed in schools these days is that they're doing much more with original testimony. When I was growing up, or maybe when some of you were growing up, it was all textbook stuff. There were dates and places and all of that. But what matters, I think, as you've seen today from Dr. Clark Rozman's story, for sure, I know a little bit about that conflict, but to hear a personal story, to hear her stand up and say, I was 15, I was there, that is something I'm going to remember and take to heart in a different way than knowing the dates and times and numbers. And I think schools are really trying to use more oral history, testimony, those kinds of things, which I think will help a lot, because when you tell a kid a story, it's really different than learning the names and places and timelines. Not that those things aren't important, but truthfully, that stuff you really can find in a book, but knowing these stories is really important. And I know in the Jewish community, because our survivors are also now in their 80s and 90s, and very few are speaking any longer, we, the 2nd generation, and now even some 3rd generation, my kids are in their 30s, are starting to carry that forward. So even though it's not the same for me to say this was my mother, it's still better than not having that connection at all. So I do speak in a lot of schools and in a lot of things, and I'm thinking in your community, you'll do the same thing too. Yours is a little more recent than ours, but that's the way to do it, is to train people to speak, to tell personal stories, because I do think that impacts the world.
I don't think it's for everyone.
Yes. Yes.
I'm not trying to.
Oh, yes. So she had asked about schools and kids, but yes, absolutely.
I think that one of the big challenges is getting the thousands of Edina residents that aren't here to hear this thing, because this sort of thing, not this particular, but I'm working on a grassroots effort, Edina Citizens Human Rights Committee, and we had a meeting in November, and I put something out on Nextdoor, and it was about human rights. So it was broader than just anything. And you should have seen the feedback I got on that comment. Well, we're all human. We all have human rights. What is this, a waste of time? Why would I bother to do, I mean, it was pretty ugly. And I didn't respond to these, but I did contact the person that sent the first message after our meeting to say, I'd like to hear what your concerns are, and I'd like to tell you how the meeting went. And what did I hear from that person? Nothing. Not a word. It was a personal. So how do we get those people that say, we all have human rights, everything is just fine, this is a waste of time? How do we get not just the kids, certainly important, but the adults as well? So any suggestions on that?
And I would say I think it's having more events like we're having today. I know, again, I've seen in the last couple of months, we've had in the schools the racial equity conversations. That didn't happen years ago. There was no diversity events years ago, not as many. I know one of the schools has for Chinese New Year's Day. That's now 2 or 3 years old. We didn't have that years ago. So I think it's continually bringing in new diverse activities, and it'll open the eyes to those people who say, we're all the same, or we don't have a problem, right? I mean, we're having more and more conversations at the community centers here, in the schools. We also have organizations now that are trying to bring down information. Joni is part of one of those organizations. Instead of, because we're losing our first generation of Holocaust survivors, she now has an organization for second, third, and fourth generation. My daughter sometimes will be aware of that one because she is a fourth generation now, actually a third generation survivor. So we tell our kids about it, and we want our kids to tell their friends about it. Because although we may all look the same, we come from different backgrounds, and we need to understand and accept those backgrounds. So I think it's having more community events like this more often to get people to open up and understand. You had a question?
Well, oh.
And there's also a lady back there who's...
I was just going to say, I think it was a month ago, I attended 2 plays in the same week. I went to the Children's Theater production of The Sneetches, which, if any of you know, is a Dr. Seuss story about how the Sneetches that have stars on their bellies are much better than those who do not, talking about difference and what makes one different and what makes one better. And it was attended by a full house. There were children of all ages and adults there. It was a tremendous performance. And I was very encouraged and enjoyed talking about that story with my niece and nephew. A couple days later, I went to a production at the Jewish Community Center in St. Louis Park, where a group of students put on a performance about a survivor of Terezin concentration camp. I don't know if I'm saying it right. And their experience and how she was the lone survivor. And it was phenomenal, but it was a small group. It was a group of a lot of older people, which I was very encouraged and very thankful to be there, and people who had actually visited the camp, and it was amazing. But I wished that there had been children attending it, and I wish that they would have been able to experience the same emotion and story that I had. And I right now am reading my niece and nephew the story of the boy in the striped pajamas, and learning to talk to them about the experience that children went through, and how it was a very important thing, and that they're not learning that in school. So there are pieces of literature that are out there that are available to kids today.
I just wanted to add, in addition to learning while you're here, I really commend you for letting your kids travel. When I first moved to Minnesota, one of the first facts I learned is that over 60% of people vacation in the same state. And while I understand that a lot of you have cabins and enjoy them, it's actually not that great for learning about the world, And it's just really, really important to stop being the helicopter parent, because what I'm noticing is like a lot of the people let their kids go on this mission or service trips that are super short, but they don't really interact with the community there. They still stay with their own group. when I was growing up, every summer, university students, they worked a month, saved up, and the next month they took a backpack and they went traveling in the Middle East or Europe. And it's by going to these different places and seeing different languages and religions, but in that context, not in your own context, but in their context, that you really understand the diversity. So just, and people are like, oh, it just costs so much. Well, believe me, the type of money that you also spend, type of things you also spend money on, I mean, just think about the depth of the experience and be a little bit more intentional about it. Lastly, I really want to say just one last thing. I mentioned before intentional diversity. You have to build it into your lifestyle. It's literally 4 blocks for me to go and order a birthday cake at Lunds, but I make it so that every time I go get a cake for my daughter, we drive all the way to Midtown Global Market. We go to a Guatemalan bakery because, it's something we have to do anyway. But I built it in so that, yes, she, we walk around, she understands the Guatemalan lady, speaks Spanish, and the cake is going to be very different and so forth. But you have to build it into your lifestyle. It can't be just one-off event here and then 6 months nothing, an event here. It just has to be really a part of your life.
Lady back there. Yeah.
I visited the Holocaust Museum a few years ago, and the thing that struck me about the museum was how subtle the propaganda was. And I spent a considerable amount of time reading the propaganda that the Nazis had put out and thinking about it and thinking, how could anybody have believed this? And yet, in our news now, we're seeing a lot of this, and I'm hoping that they're teaching children how to figure out what's true and what's not true.
And I think it's to say that it's all of our responsibilities, so that the schools hopefully are looking at it. We talk about what are the beginning creeping injustices that are occurring before a full-blown genocide occurs. We should all be looking for that. Parents too. As parents, we need to be reminded of what we're seeing and talk to our kids about it. So you're right, it creeps in there very slowly. People don't realize it, and then by the time it comes, as Taya has said, your genocide is here already. So the point is to really get out of our bubble, to talk to other people. The teachers are teaching it. We as parents or aunts and uncles also have to tell our kids about it. So we really just have to expand our horizon on it.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to wrap up. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I'm Pat Arsenault with the Human Rights and Relations Commission. We're just going to wrap up now. I just want to remind you, as Jan said in the beginning, if you would please take a moment to fill out that questionnaire, we'd really appreciate it. We've kind of got a box as you exit, or you can give it to one of us, one of the commissioners. Just a few, I want to make a few comments. I want to thank Caribou Coffee for donating our coffee here for this event. It was the Caribou of the Lunds and Byerlys at 50th and France, and another Caribou Coffee on France. And then I just want to note that you've heard earlier that the Human Rights Commission does this event annually, our Days of Remembrance event. Normally, members of the commission put it on. This year, we've opened up and made a working group, so members of the community who are interested in working on the event, we asked them to participate. And I just want to recognize those community members who participated and helped us plan the event. And if you would just stand, Nettie Singal, you met her a little earlier. And, Lena, she helped us within the program. Thank you. And Jan Seidman, who you met, and thank you for participating on our panel and sharing your story. I also wanted to mention that our commission includes two student commissioners every year. The commission has 2 students, and this year our students were very active in planning this event, and you met them a little earlier, but I'm going to just ask them to stand, if you could both stand. Connie Chow, who is a senior at Edina High School, and Prasoon Sinha, who is a junior at Edina High School. Thank you. And I also want to, of course, give thanks to our mayor, Mayor Jim Hovland, who always welcomes us and gave really some insightful remarks, and we want to thank him for his support and understanding that we really do need to keep this event going every year. And then, of course, I just lastly would like to ask you to join me in thanking our guests for a really excellent and informative and moving program. Thank you both. And that concludes our program. Please feel free to look at the exhibits on your way out, and remember to give us that questionnaire. Thank you.